All right. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spring 2022 Department of Anthropology Colloquium Series at the University of New Mexico, which sits on unceded indigenous territory and the traditional homelands of multiple sovereign nations, such as the Pueblo, Diné, and Apache peoples. Today's speaker is somebody who many of you know, Jana Meyer, a PhD student in the Archaeology Subfield in the UNM Department of Anthropology. Jana grew up in Germany and received a bachelor's degree in archaeology, as well as another bachelor's degree in ancient American studies from the University of Bonn. She then moved to the United States and joined us here at UNM. She started in the PhD program in 2019. Jana's dissertation work investigates the relationship between social inequality, physical activity patterns, and skeletal evidence of health and disease in early medieval Germany. In the talk today, Jana will be presenting some initial results from a recent pilot study focusing on the relationship between social status and osteoarthritis in a German medieval skeletal sample. Jana has accomplished a lot for being so early on in her career. Most recently, Jana was a recipient of the Frida Butler Award here at UNM. All right, thank you very much, Jana, for being willing to speak with us today. Take it away.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for being here and for giving me the opportunity to talk about osteoarthritis, which is yeah, a sort of recent passion of mine. And let's just get started. So in this talk, I'm going to present to you first some background on osteoarthritis in general as a disease, what it is. And then for the second half of this talk, I will be moving to my case study that looks at osteoarthritis in a Merovingian skeletal sample that is early medieval. So I just want to let you know that there will be some images, I think actually just one image of skeletal human remains later on in this talk. I kept that to an absolute minimum. And that individual, those images that I'm showing to you, they are European remains. So let's start with a still pretty common assumption about osteoarthritis. For instance, the online medical encyclopedia offers this information on osteoarthritis. They say osteoarthritis is the most common joint disorder. It is due to aging and wear and tear on the joint. However, more recent research, including from UNM faculty, that is Ian Wallace, has drawn this assumption to question. So we will get into that a little bit throughout this talk. But now, what is osteoarthritis? So the definition that I'm going to present you will follow the definition offered by the Osteoarthritis Research Society International. And it defines it as osteoarthritis being a disorder that affects movable joints. It is usually initiated by micro and or macro injury to a joint. And this then in turn activates some repair responses, which can be maladaptive. And these repair responses, they include pro-inflammatory pathways. Eventually, these processes then lead to cartilage degeneration or degradation, bone remodeling, and osteophyte formation. Osteophytes are those little bony outgrowths at the joint margins that can occur and that are a little bit hinted at in this schematic that you see to the right. And all of this can eventually leads to joint inflammation and can lead to a loss of the normal function of the joint. On the image to the right, you can see a progression of arthritic changes to this stylized knee joint. And that is beginning with just a bit of cartilage loss. then progressing to leading to a reduced joint space, and eventually progressing through ever worsened cartilage degeneration and joint space reduction until it comes to bone-on-bone contact. But why would we care about osteoarthritis? So if it is simply something that comes with age and with the lifelong use of our joints, there's no really good way around it, and we might as well just accept it as part of life and death eventually. So it would seem. But still, the Osteoarthritis Research Society International, who made a nice little infographic that I'm going to show you, they ask, is osteoarthritis a serious disease? And they say, yes, 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 and this is why. And I love how emphatic they are about that. I'm totally on board. So it is a serious disease, and it is very common worldwide, affecting more than 240 million people, about 2/3 of which are female. And it is not only widespread, but what is really bad about it is the way in which osteoarthritis limits the life of the people affected by it by immobilizing them. And it is a leading cause for disability in older adults. And 80% of those diagnosed with osteoarthritis are limited in their movement, and a quarter even cannot perform normal everyday activities. So this has, of course, very profound impacts on people's quality of life, and can also lead to a huge suite of other adverse health outcomes. Related to that, especially related to the decrease in activity that often accompanies osteoarthritis naturally because of the pain. And that leads to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, and in the end, death. This is not necessarily a unidirectional relationship, since risk factors for osteoarthritis also include obesity, which in and of itself is also a risk factor for these other health threats. So this could be represented as a kind of a negative feedback loop. For instance, osteoarthritis will often lead, as I mentioned, to a reduction of physical activity as far as a person can afford to reduce their activity. Not everybody is able to, and which then just leads to more pain, of course. And the decrease in activity increases the risk for obesity, and that in turn will exacerbate the progression of osteoarthritis and so forth. And once this feedback loop is in place, each of these components essentially acts as an exacerbating factor for the others. And at the same time, it's specifically the lack of activity, and if present, obesity. Of course, obesity doesn't always have to be in the play. Those are then likely to increase this risk of this entire metabolic syndrome that I mentioned. So aside from the metabolic syndrome, and also associated with the disease, are other comorbidities. These include depression, osteoporosis, and the risk for falling and fracturing bones. Those, again, are common problems associated with a decrease in activity. Even depression can be associated with a lack of activity, though frankly, I would assume the pain alone from osteoarthritis can be a risk for depression on its own too. So thinking about the past, we might also assume that similar issues might have been associated with osteoarthritis affecting people in the past, though not everybody would have been in the position of luxury, essentially, to reduce their physical activity. So those comorbidities, they may have varied depending on society or depending on sectors of society. But we can't really see cardiovascular disease or diabetes, those kind of things, in skeletal remains, of course. But importantly, this loop can really be started at any one of these points, including with too low activity levels, which is very interesting, as the recent research by Ian Wallace and colleagues showed with empirical data from animal models that lack of physical activity actually increased the risk for developing osteoarthritis in guinea pigs. And therefore, in this kind of complex and messy etiology of osteoarthritis, all those directional arrows that I showed you can really also go in the opposite direction. And this feedback loop, it works both way around. And now please don't think that I'm saying that these relationships are deterministic in any way. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's not like if one of them is in place, the others will definitely follow. Again, not that simple. But what we know is that these kind of three components of this loop are very frequently associated with each other, and they are frequent in the modern society, on the rise, actually, all of it. And that turns them kind of into risk factors for each other. And it really seems, excuse me, it seems that the reduction in physical activity that often comes with osteoarthritis seems to be really at the core, pretty close to the core of many of those associated problems. For example, in the 2013 Global Burden of Disease study, they found that there was a 55% increased risk of death associated with osteoarthritis, and that is controlled for age. And what they found is also that the more severe the osteoarthritis-induced walking disability, the greater was the risk of death, especially due to cardiovascular disease. And that relationship was statistically quite significant. And so please enjoy this p-value, because I'm sorry to already let you know that that is the only p-value you will see, because the data that I'm going to show you later from my own study is very preliminary with a small sample size. So what I'm telling you there will be mostly charts, but there's one significant value for you, even though I didn't produce it. And yeah, so talking about physical activity, I'd like to point out that, in fact, even when osteoarthritis is already diagnosed, the CDC actually recommends increasing regular physical activity as a method of managing osteoarthritis. Because an increase in responsible, medically directed increase in physical activity is supposed to, first of all, reduce pain, actually, and also reduce comorbidities. And all of that together, quite obviously, should improve the quality of life of a patient quite a bit. But note that I'm not offering any medical advice or anything like that. I'm not saying if your joint hurts, just move it more. That could also go very wrong. But I'm just saying this as a bioarchaeologist fascinated by everything and anything that has to do with osteoarthritis. And I'm mentioning this because I feel that it shows just how complex osteoarthritis and the whole problem is in the way in which it's interwoven with activity levels. So a thing that can be in some ways implicated in its etiology when activity occurs in a way that a joint is not prepared for, thus then leading to those macro injuries. It can also be a preventative measure by strengthening joints, and it can be a way to manage existing osteoarthritis. So it all depends on a lot of many things, and it makes it so complex. But this feedback loop that I just showed, that was obviously still not the whole story. So let's get back to some more osteoarthritis risk factors for a moment. We already talked about obesity, low activity levels, joint overuse, those things. But keep in mind that what constitutes overuse for a specific joint in a particular person is very variable and depends on many individual and environmental factors. So another risk factor, possibly among the most important ones, is joint injury. That is a very big one. And it also now means that on a level of societal risk factors, things that increase injury risk also come into the mix of osteoarthritis risk factors. And other risk factors that were specifically identified in epidemiological studies on the disease are systemic inflammation levels. And there are many that affect those inflammation levels. Muscle weakness is another risk factor, particularly when it comes to knee osteoarthritis, specifically the quadriceps muscles of the thigh that are, when weak, associated with an increased osteoarthritis risk. And this makes sense because muscle is also a kind of a buffering mechanism for joint loads. And it also, of course, helps to stabilize a joint and protect from injury. And the critical factor about muscle strength is that it is about strength, not volume. That's also a thing that was found out. And all these things can, in most cases, be really affected or moderated by lifestyle. Of course, there are also some other risk factors that cannot be much changed. We already talked about age and sex as being among them. It has also been found that genetics play a role in individual vulnerability to developing the disease. For example, in Iceland, they did a large study on the subject using genetic data, and they were able to kind of identify certain, they called it osteoarthritis families in Iceland that are particularly prone to the disease. So this list is by no means exhaustive even, but you can see that osteoarthritis is clearly a multifactorial disease. And you probably also notice right away that these risk factors are not all independent from each other. They also can kind of play together, interact with each other. And that makes it hard to tease out different components of risk factors, and it's probably one of the reasons why so many osteoarthritis studies start out by saying first just how important it is to study osteoarthritis, pretty much like I just did. And then they go on by pointing out how poorly understood its etiology still is, kind of like I'm doing as well. So you cannot imagine how often I read precisely these combination of sentences in very many studies. And yeah, so let's remember that initial statement of osteoarthritis being due to age and wear and tear. And I hope that I was able to show you that it's really not that simple at all. And I found this best illustrated in a study published by Ian Paulus and colleagues in 2017, in which, in a diachronic study based on archaeological skeletons from different time periods, including some more recent documented collections, including the Maxwell collection, they found that osteoarthritis has doubled in prevalence since the mid-20th century. And this alone might not have been new, but as I kept referring myself to obesity in earlier slides, that is one of the factors that has usually been brought up as an explanation for how this osteoarthritis kind of turned into a kind of epidemic in many places. And that would be that, yeah, people are increasing their BMI on average, and people also starting to get older. That was another explanation that was often, or is often generally provided for this. But what they found is then that after they controlled for age and for BMI, they found that this doubling of osteoarthritis prevailed. So longevity and an increase in BMI on average are not sufficient to explain this modern increase in osteoarthritis. So clearly other processes are at play here. So what they're suggesting is that osteoarthritis could really be considered a mismatch disease. That is, osteoarthritis might be a disease that today is so much more prevalent and severe in our society because we are living in a modern environment that is characterized by lifestyle factors for which we are evolutionary not well adapted. And part of that can be diet as well as these relatively little physical activity levels compared to the conditions in which we think our earliest ancestors lived and evolved. And in a different study, they also found that another kind of mismatch also works as a risk factor and can exacerbate the risk for osteoarthritis. And that is a mismatch between early life and later in life conditions. So in the different study, they found that among the Tarahumara, the community that is in current energy transition, that individuals experiencing this mismatch between their earlier life and their later life, in that they grew up with relative energy scarcity, but later in life lived in a context of a relative energy abundance, they had an increased risk for accumulating abdominal adipose tissue. So the fat that lies in the belly region around the organs. And this tissue is particularly pro-inflammatory for the system. It increases systemic inflammation more than other subcutaneous fat usually does. And by increasing these inflammation values, it increases the risk for osteoarthritis. Now, there is yet another set of risk factors, and those are socioeconomic in nature. A recent study based on a nationwide survey in South Korea with more than 9,000 participants demonstrated strong links between socioeconomic status and the prevalence and severity of osteoarthritis. They individually tested the effect of 3 measures of SES, socioeconomic status, that is education, income, and occupation. And they found that all 3 served as predictors for osteoarthritis and predicted the resulting pain level, loss of joint function, and also disability. So this figure from the article shows the prevalence of knee osteoarthritis in male, both by income and educational status. Both these variables are divided into 4 categories. The income is divided into quartiles, Q1 to the left being the lowest income quartile. And you can see that when income is concerned, those in the lowest quartiles tended to have more osteoarthritis, while those in the highest quartiles had the least amount. And similarly, the lower the education level, that is on the other axis, also the greater the affliction with osteoarthritis. In terms of occupation, they found that they compared managerial occupations, non-managerial occupations, and unemployment, and they found that the strongest relationship existed between unemployment and knee osteoarthritis. However, among all their measures, occupation was the weakest association with osteoarthritis compared to income and education. The latter was actually the strongest. So today, in living people, osteoarthritis is usually clinically diagnosed based on symptoms reported by the patients and by a series of standardized X-rays that are designed to assess the narrowing of joint space, and by that means the degradation of joint cartilage. However, both those important diagnostic indicators, symptoms and joint space, or cartilage for that matter, are not available when we are working with archaeological human remains. Rather, they're mostly not available. There's one skeletal indicator of osteoarthritis that does speak to us about joint space, rather about the absence thereof. And that we can see in skeletons even when all cartilage has gone the way of all cartilage, really. And that is hibernation. So, and this is the slide where I in a bit show human remains picture. Hibernation happens when all cartilage has been lost in at least a part of the joint, and it comes to bone-on-bone contact as shown here in this, again, schematic knee joint. And on the actual bone, it looks like this. I hope you can recognize it on your screen. Here you see to the left the knee portion of a femur, that is the thigh bone part of your knee. And on the right side, you see the inside surface of a patella, the kneecap. So you see the both surfaces that articulate like that with each other in life. And I hope you can see on your screen that there's this large patch of polished looking flat bone on both sides. I think it's much easier to see on the patella. And this polishing is the result of bone rubbing on bone. You can even see some grooves running along the axis of joint movement along there, telling us that the joint was really still in much movement after there was already pretty large amount of bone-to-bone contact. And that is a case in which even a bioarchaeologist can say, yes, that joint space was reduced. We do have a case that we can diagnose as osteoarthritis here. And without it, if we do not have emanation to look at, we cannot actually tell anything about the joint space, whether it was reduced. We cannot say that with certainty, or even whether an individual would have been in pain or impaired by any means. But still going with with emanation, there's obviously a very severe stage already of osteoarthritis. There are stages before that, they are just not very reliably diagnosable, unfortunately, in skeletal remains. But also, while we are looking at this slide, notice these macroporosities here, those large holes that I'm pointing out. And maybe it's a little harder to see, but maybe you can recognize where those blue arrows point. Those are some plaque-like bone deposits on the joint surface. Those are other pathological joint changes that are sometimes used by researchers to diagnose arthritic conditions, or at least pathological changes to a joint. So obviously, how to define osteoarthritis as present or absent in skeletal individuals makes all the difference when it comes to determining its prevalence. This is a problem for comparability between studies or between populations and everything. The less strict the criteria, the higher the prevalence, of course. And this is a problem that I've been running into. How do I best define osteoarthritis to be present for comparability with other studies? So what I'm showing you here is a scoring scheme developed by 𝗦𝗲𝗿𝗄𝗆, which is very widely used in Germany. And so I decided to use it too. I was taught it in Germany with a bioarchaeologist who supervised me there, Jana Meyer. And let me explain it to you a little bit. So those columns with the Roman numerals 1 through 6, they represent the severity and extent of changes to the joint, while the rows A, B, and C, they distinguish between different kinds of changes. Emanation belongs to the A row, starting at score 4, and category B describes porosity with macroporosity that I just showed you, starting at score 4 again. In category C, then you find bone deposits with the larger plaque-like deposits, again, starting at score 4. And that's why in many studies in Germany, Schulz and his students, they tend to score arthritic changes to be present when any kind of surface feature with a score 4 is observable. So that is there a minimum requirement for osteoarthritis to count as present. Because I was interested in the progression of osteoarthritis and different severities, of osteoarthritis in my sample. For my pilot study, I decided to assess the prevalence of osteoarthritis following different diagnostic criteria. So the loosest one would be the one that I have inserted right now there, the one starting at score 4. It would involve the greatest amount of people being diagnosed with osteoarthritis. And in the following, I will later refer to this criterion as minimum mild or mild osteoarthritis, when it's just the score 4. But to set the criteria a little bit stricter, I also ran analysis defining osteoarthritis at score 5, to which I then later will refer to as advanced. This will come up later again when I show you my odds ratios. And lastly, I also evaluated my data in the most conservative manner by only considering hibernation as truly indicative of osteoarthritis. That's the most restrictive way. So I have these 3 levels of restriction, 3 ways of defining osteoarthritis as being present or not. And I am doing that for both knee joints and hip joints. For my dissertation, I'm looking at all the joint surfaces, but here I'm just focusing on those that today are most prevalent, or among the most prevalent: hip arthritis and knee arthritis. And with that, let's move into my case study. Here I am, as you already know, investigating the relationship between social status and osteoarthritis in a Merovingian period sample from Thuringia, which is in Germany. And I was interested here in whether this pattern of increased osteoarthritis risk for individuals with lower socioeconomic status would also be observable in the past, that is, in this Merovingian period in Germany. So the Merovingian period dates between 450 and 751, after which the Carolingians took over. And this period marks the beginning of the early Middle Ages. It is also often considered a time of transition between the Roman Empire and then what we consider later the Middle Ages. It falls into what's also often called the Dark Ages. And this is a time also when the Merovingian controlled parts of Europe converted to Christianity, mostly. The heartland of the Merovingian world is what the Romans called Gaul or Gallia, which you can see here. And this was before all the modern nations and their borders existed. But for orientation, here you can see that the realm pretty much encompassed all of France and big parts of adjacent countries, including Germany. And up here in the right corner, you see Erfurt. And this is very close to where my sample comes from. The Merovingians really are a dynasty emerging out of the Frankish tribe. And in a nutshell, really simplified, they took over power and subsequently united, that is conquered, many of the neighboring tribes over the course of their reign. Gregory, Bishop of Tours, who lived in the 6th century, is among the most important sources for the Merovingian kingdom. And through him and other chroniclers like him, we have a pretty good idea about the life of kings in the court, ecclesial life, laws, court cases, and more. And unfortunately, not as much about peasant life, but some glimpses. And this dynasty starts with Childeric I, it ends with Childeric III. And one more noteworthy king was Clovis I. He was the one who converted to Christianity. And just as a fun fact for the archaeologist, he is also the namesake for the Clovis points that are found in North America, kind of indirectly, because allegedly, that is according to Wikipedia, the daughter of the founder of Clovis in New Mexico was just reading about him, the Merovingians, when they were looking for a name for the town. So that is how he ended up many centuries later lending his name to this Clovis point. But as I mentioned, I'm interested in the effects of social status on osteoarthritis risk among the Merovingians. So here's a little bit about laws and society. We're dealing here with an early feudalistic society in which an estimated 80 to 90% of the population were peasants. There was an established system of slavery and sort of unfreedom is what the books often call it, similar to serfdom. And among the most important laws during that time is the Lex 𝗖𝗍𝗍, the law of the Salish Franks, with which the Merovingians are. In this document, there's a system of blood price being detailed out that shows how the worth of a person was depending on their social status of freedom, age, sex, and occupation. For instance, was one to kill a free Frank, one would have to pay about 200, I think it would be solidi, to the family to avoid a blood feud. For a woman in childbearing age or for a person in the service of the king, it would be 600, so triple that. While for a slave or otherwise unfree individual like a serf, it would be only 45. And that would not be paid to that family, but to the owner, quote unquote, of that person. So to my sample, it comes from where you can see it right there, smack in the middle of Germany, from 𝗏𝗏𝗏, which was excavated in 2019 and 2020 by the Thuringian State Heritage Agency as a salvage excavation. And the analysis of those skeletal remains and materials are still in progress. That's why this is preliminary. Here you can see it again closer up, and you can see that it's pretty much in the countryside with a lot of fields around. And that is how we would think that it was in the past as well. So it's a countryside location. And just as a side note, up there, Sondershausen, that's another site that I will later on incorporate in my dissertation to increase sample size further. So this dates to the Merovingian period, roughly the 6th and 7th century. And then an estimated total of 60 individuals. But in my pilot study, or for my pilot study, I collected data from 35 of those so far last year. Here you can see the sex distribution of individuals. It is seems to be fairly common for Merovingian samples that there are more females than males, actually. So I found that in some other literature as well. This is the distribution of age groups and how I defined them for the purpose of this study. Those 8 juveniles that there are, they fall out of my sample for osteoarthritis. However, since earliest traces of pathological joint changes already appear in one adolescent, I did keep that age group in. That brings my sample with observations for osteoarthritis of either the hip or the knee to 27. Then it gets divided up even further into status groups. Luckily for archaeologists, the Merovingians tended to bury their dead still with grave goods, despite converting to Christianity, so even after that, which provides a proxy for social status, always based on the assumption that this reflects the wealth of the individual and or of their family background. And based on grave goods, I defined 3 groups in my sample. The low status burials or non-elite individuals are characterized by 0 to 3 grave goods. They usually have no weapons, but they have otherwise fairly simple things, very often knives or simple belt buckles, spindle whorls for females. Sometimes they are combs made of bone or a little bit of pottery. Then there's this middle group that kind of just falls in the middle between them. They are usually having like 4 to 6 grave goods, or they might have less than that, but included certain wealth indicators like this glass vessel. And glass is super rare during that time period and area. So that might have even been an import, and it would be really a fancy thing to have. That's why I could not put that individual into the low status group. Now, those classified as high status, they all have more than 10 grave goods. Males often have weapons. And here you can see a close-up of this nice sword. And women often with somewhat more elaborate jewelry. One woman even had a gold coin. And you can also often notice a difference in quality of the things. Even the belt buckles look fancier. the comb, maybe you can see it, I hope you can, there's some nice engravings and decorations on it. So there's a difference in quality and often also in, in quantity and often also in quality. And that I use to define my status groups. But then you might already be thinking that middle group is a little bit fuzzy on the edges. So I kicked that out of the comparison for osteoarthritis. So I'm comparing two groups, the low status, non-elite group, the high status or elite group. I define them as elite, at least in the context of this cemetery, which really are pretty drastically different in their burial dirt. Because age is so important when talking about osteoarthritis. Here I'm showing you the age composition of the high status and low status groups. And you clearly see a problem already because for some reason, and I don't really have an explanation for that, the old adult individuals are much more represented in the low status group than in the high status group. And that is a problem for comparing them. Nonetheless, I'll start comparing them. So this bar graph compares the affliction of the different age groups among the two status groups with different severities of osteoarthritis. So mild again refers to the score of 4 that I showed you earlier, advanced to the score of 5, and then there's hibernation. The probably most important thing to gather here is that the presence of hibernation shows up at a much younger age among the low status individuals, starting in the young adult age group. Nonetheless, be reminded that these are tiny samples, and many of those blocks just represent one person. So this is why I call this preliminary, super preliminary. And I'm curious to see if how this develops with more data, but all of this has to be taken with a grain or a bucket of salt. So now, when comparing the prevalence of any degree of osteoarthritis in all individuals older than 17 years or 17 years and older, we see that non-elites are showing a greater affliction with osteoarthritis than elites. And this again is applying the least restrictive criteria to diagnosing osteoarthritis. Then when only hibernation is considered, there's virtually no difference between the two groups. But then again, remember that this is comparing the two groups with a big caveat of having a vastly different age composition. So when I try to control for this by some means through removing all adults 50 years and older, you see a bit of a larger difference. Still, this is now only considering hibernation, so the strictest criteria. And there's none in this age category among the elites that shows it, as kind of the bar graph already showed. While still 33% of the non-elites do exhibit hibernation at this younger age range. And this, by the way, all of this is hip osteoarthritis, because when I divide it up between hip and knee osteoarthritis, the charts show that only hip hibernation is present among any of the individuals in my sample that are younger than 50 years old. No knee hibernation at this age yet. These last charts now show my data a little bit the other way around. You see here that most individuals exhibiting hibernation are from the lower status group. This is also the case when only hip hibernation is considered. But don't forget again that this is a big sample size difference between high status and low status individuals. You can see it again. So this might really be what's driving this distribution. Nonetheless, when we look at knee hibernation, we see that the proportions of high and low status individuals are even despite this big sample size difference. But this could hint at something potentially interesting, but each half of this pie is represented by only one individual. So I am hesitant to interpret too much into that at this point again. Let's wait for a little bit more data. Now I did some odds ratios, which I'm showing you here. Odds ratios are often used in clinical studies to compare health outcomes, usually as a binary, like present or absent, between two groups. In clinical trials, those groups are often those that received a specific treatment or that were exposed to a pathogen or something of that sort. And here my two groups are the elite and non-elite groups that I'm comparing. And the ratios here indicate the likelihood or risk for low status individuals to have OA as an outcome. And that's one for hip and for knee I'm showing you here. Most of these odds ratios are dancing pretty close around 1, and 1 would indicate absolutely no difference between the two groups. There are only 2 odds ratios that are a little more removed from 1. First, there's a ratio of 2 for mild joint changes or a minimum of mild joint changes in the knee, indicating an about double risk for this occurring among the non-elites, which again consists of a much larger proportion of old adults. And it may even be more surprising than there's basically no difference in the hip osteoarthritis distribution. But second, in my sample, there was a decreased likelihood for non-elite individuals to experience knee urination. This result comes from the fact that there are only 2 individuals with knee osteoarthritis, one elite, one non-elite, but the non-elite individual is part of a much larger sample of non-elite individuals with without urination, as we saw in this large pie chart. Once again, we shall not forget this problem with the different age composition of the 2 groups here, mainly due to the old adults. So when I account for that, by removing all individuals over the age of 49 from the sample, we have a much more similar age composition and also a more similar sample size, much smaller even. And we have different odds ratios. Most notably, the risk for the most advanced expressions of hip osteoarthritis for low status individuals is 5 times greater than that for high status individuals. It is a pretty high value and might actually hint at some interesting trends here. So while the precise percentages I have shown you may not be exactly representative given the small sample size, but this overall pattern does appear to fit with a modern day observation that SES increases the risk for osteoarthritis. This pattern seems to hold true for both the past and the present, as at least for these societies, and as expressed in my small sample. So to sum this up, we see that in the sample, elites are proportionally more affected by osteoarthritis, non-elites more affected than elites. Urination appears at younger ages than in the non-elite sample, and this is what other researchers, especially Germain, has highlighted as something that can actually be significant when comparing different groups, the age of onset. Odds ratios show that non-elite individuals under 50 years had a 5 times greater risk for more severe stages of osteoarthritis. And as I just said, it kind of falls in this modern socioeconomic status pattern. So there are some assumptions that I'd like to bring up before concluding or before ending about non-elite individuals with the Merovingian societies that could have to do with, if it holds true, this increased affliction of the non-elites. One would be presumably higher workloads than elites because production had to occur beyond the family and personal needs to pay taxes. That might also have given them a greater injury risk. They may have had a less ability for rest when being injured or sick. That is because they depended on a continued production because a loss of income, that being harvest or craft work, could lead to a loss of freedom that is documented. Individuals without any means to support them anymore sometimes sold themselves into unfreedom, themselves and their families. And they may have had less nutritional resource ability than elites too. And with that, a greater susceptibility for infections and other disease may have occurred. And this less resource availability is partially or could partially be connected to somewhat deterioration of infrastructure during that time. So it was way more expensive to export anything from anything else other than local things. The elite would do that. They would import olive oil. That was a popular thing to import, but not so much for the non-elites. They also would have had less access to medical care, while elites sometimes had their own medic. And all this probably accumulated to increased physiological and also psychological stress due to the things that are associated with this low status position. And that in turn might have increased general inflammation load. All of this is really speculative. So it's just kind of what I came up based on what I read. As a takeaway, I hope that I was able to show you that socioeconomic status can affect osteoarthritis in the present and in the past. There are different risk factors that vary between societies. We have overuse and underuse as risk factors, both of which can also lead to an increased injury risk. We have energy transition as a potential problem. Inflammation levels, which can be associated with stress, infectious disease, parasite, and a whole suite of things. Diet is one that I didn't really mention, but that's another component that can affect osteoarthritis. And public health implications of all this are that anything that would have to do with public outreach and mitigation programs to address osteoarthritis in a particular society must be really context dependent, because it will vary a lot between the social context of an individual or of a group. What are the most important risk factors there? And the same is true for archaeological implications. So osteoarthritis cannot be interpreted in a one-on-one relationship with any of those risk factors. This all is to be continued to increase my sample size. So my data collection continues in May. So next month, in Weimar, where we'll increase the sample size, there is a pretty high data volume, much more than I presented to you here per individual. That includes that I record all the joints. I do a comprehensive paleopathological analysis. I trying some attempts to reconstruct activity patterns as well, to somehow control for that. And there might be the possibility, depending on the grant, to do isotopic dietary reconstruction as well. So lastly, I want to thank you. I received a lot of support for this, both financially, and I should have mentioned the 𝗭𝗏𝗏𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵 Award too. Thank you very much for that. And I also had academic support from people who helped me when I was in great distress over this talk. So thank you all very much.
Nicely done, Jana. If anybody has any questions, I encourage you to just go ahead and turn on your camera and ask a question.
Sorry for going so long.
Oh, you're okay. I have a question. So my question is, in thinking about the, I wonder like what additional information you might need to evaluate on an individual level, like what might have been the cause of osteoarthritis. I mean, having hibernation of the hip in a young individual would be extremely rare today, and so I'm thinking about like what might have been the causes. So the list of things that you came up with at the end, it seems that some of those things might be expected to lead to the disease in one side of the body, as opposed to other, like maybe systemic factors leading to joint disease in both sides. And there have been studies that have shown that like people with, say with obesity or metabolic syndrome or something like that, that tends to have like a systematic or a systemic effect. So both knees, both hips tend to be affected, whereas injuries are usually associated with like unilateral or one side being affected. So I guess my first question is, Did you see any patterning in terms of like, do all the people just have the disease in one side, or do some of them have it on both sides? And maybe that provides some clue about what's causing it.
I do collect information from both sides, so I will compare that. I have not systematically evaluated that, but that is a great thing. I do remember though that the one individual, the young adult that already had ipponation, the hip, that was on one side. I do just remember that individual. So yeah, that could have been, I have no idea, maybe some really mean injury of something. There was no fracture associated with that. I am recording fractures to look at, to get at least an idea of injury risk and things that could be associated with that. I did not see anything else, but when I was talking about that, was Heather, she brought up maybe there could be just some weird genetic defect that the, or just like factor that could have caused a cartilage defect for that person in the hip. So maybe it's something like that too. So
yeah, sometimes people, it may be, yeah, I mean, sometimes you can have just some sort of weird, weird's not the right word, rare developmental sort of alignment of the hip that can lead to sort of abnormal loading or something like that. That oftentimes when people talk about the genetics of osteoarthritis, really genetics primarily are influencing sort of an abnormal shape of the joint itself, which then causes like some sort of abnormal loading. So you could like check for that to see if there's something that's weird about the geometry of the hip or something like that.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's that is a very good one. I do record hip angle and knee angle for all individuals, but I'll look like individually at other components that are maybe not so as measurable. And I just earlier mentioned to Ozzy that for the other side, 𝗏𝗏𝗏, that I have not yet looked at, but will be part of my dissertation, there's actually going to be genetic data for all of the individuals. So if I will find some really early arthritis there, again, in multiple people, I could conceivably check if they are related to each other or something like that. But that is, I might not find anything of that sort. Like, hopefully for them, they didn't have it that early, but we'll see.
Well, cool. Look into the bilateral versus unilateral thing. That might actually provide some clues, and that's a pretty simple thing to evaluate.
Definitely. Yeah, that's great. That's nice and straightforward. I love straightforward things.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. So I have a kind of a sort of a general question. And that is that kind of in thinking about this, maybe one of the biggest contrasts you might expect might be between really elite women and the lowest class women, in which I might expect that the really poorer women would be pulled into the world of labor in a way that wealthy women might be able to escape if they wanted. And I wondered if, like, impressionistically, if you had seen any possible evidence of that so far in skeletons.
I did impressionistically again see some difference in robusticity kind of the arms. There were some really robust women and some really gracile ones. I was hoping to be able to do odds ratio on that for the different women in the different societies, but I did not have enough data to populate like a matrix like that without having like most of it being zeros. So I could not statistically evaluate that for this, but it is something that I'm semi-expecting as well. So that kind of distribution. While I did, that seemed to be less the case for males in my impression. So some individuals that I knew were high status, they were really robust.
Steph.
Hi.
Jana. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed your talk, and it's always fun to get to listen to somebody talk about things that they're really enthusiastic about, and you totally got me excited about osteoarthritis. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was really enjoyable.
Thanks, that makes me feel good. Thanks you.
Yeah, you did a great job.
Any other compliments?
More questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to say great talk, Jana. I guess at the very end you were talking about, I guess, trying to reconstruct activity patterns. I was just wondering if, like, have you considered how you plan to do that? I don't know if that's like standard procedure, looking at bones looking at skeletons like this, but I'm just wondering how one does that.
That's a very good question, and it is actually one that is really controversial about what are appropriate ways. Some people would say, it's just, there's so much that goes into the shape and of bones and attachments that you really cannot link that to much detail of activity. But there's one recent method that I'm really, really eager to use on this sample that uses multivariate analysis of a set of 9 hand entheses. It was developed by Alexandros Karakostis in Tübingen, at the University of Tübingen, him and his whole team of researchers. And with a historic sample of known occupation, they were able to quite reliably differentiate between individuals who engaged in activities that could be considered force grip based and those that were considered precision fine grip based. And that is a differentiation that I do want to attempt between those individuals, and then see if that might be related to any patterns. First of all, between high elite and non-elite, and that between the sexes, and then potential relationships to different locations or forms of osteoarthritis if present. There are also other means that work with the general pattern of muscle attachment sites that is very often used, but also often critiqued. I am collecting all that information in the hope of maybe combining it with this hand data and refining it, also in case if I don't get the appropriate hand data, so to speak. I'm also scanning arm bones, so I can look at the shape that can inform on directionality. But in absolutely any case, I would not be able to say this group of people did that, or that group of people did this. What I will hope, though, to achieve is to see that just difference. People did different things, so that I can say, okay, there was a difference in loading of certain limbs, etc., for which I then could hopefully control. But that is really the iffiest aspect. Like, I would be happiest if I can definitely do this hand enthesis thing, because that is has been validated with known data and applied in very cool studies. But yeah, fingers crossed for that. It requires a good hand preservation, and many individuals don't have all the bones required. I scanned them, so it works on 3-dimensional analyses. And I have a lot of hand scans, but they're not always complete. So it also depends a little bit if there's a way to refine the method to use not the entire set, but a subset of that. And that still has to be kind of filled with. Excellent question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, if not, let's all thank Jana and go enjoy the beautiful windy day outside. All right. Thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
All right, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.